Well, good evening, everyone. I also want to start by acknowledging and giving thanks for our presence here on the traditional territories of the Conway people, and to Skip David for his warm welcome to us. I'm honored to be here. I also want to thank the Social Justice Studies program and Professor William Carroll. It's a wonderful honor to be asked to give this lecture. And also to the University of Victoria, and especially the Political Science Department, and Professor James Tully, who have welcomed me here this semester as part of the first sabbatical of my life, which, let me tell you, is a magical condition to be in. And finally, thank you all for coming tonight. So it's a wonderful honor to address you, and I look forward to your response and to the response of the other panel, all the women up here who are going to talk about this. Yeah. So the title of my talk is The Global Justice Movement Colonial, a troubling tale of Indigenous peoples at the World Social Forum. And just let me start by saying a little bit about where this project has come from. And there are really two major sources. One is the larger body of work that I've been doing over the last decade on the World Social Forum since its inception in 2001. And I'll talk a bit about the World Social Forum tonight, just so you know the context that I'm talking about. But in general, over the last decade, I have been, along with many other commentators and activists who've been involved in it, I've noted its incredible dynamism, its diversity, its plurality, its ethos of self-organizing, and the incredible way in which it has attracted movements from around the world into this broad convergence against neoliberal globalization. I've been excited by that, and a lot of my work has actually been very dedicated to trying to describe it and to defend it from its detractors and to explore its potentialities. However, over time, I have also been increasingly troubled by what I see as the recurrence or the reproduction or the reappearance of hegemonies and marginalities in terms of who was speaking, what kinds of bodies were speaking, what kinds of bodies were present, what kinds of discourses had authority, in a space that's a putatively open space, a space that's egalitarian, a space of justice, a space of the movement of movements, an incredible space where plurality and diversity are celebrated and enacted, and in which there is politics against all forms of what's called in Spanish pensamientos únicos, or these unitary forms of thought that exclude other ways of thinking. And also the very important fact that the World Social Forum is critically positioned in the Global South. So it's positioned in this matrix of North-South power relations in a global justice movement which has had many expressions in the North, as we know, and the World Social Forum is critically positioned in the Global South. It's also, of course, characterized by thoroughgoing anti-imperialist discourses, anti-neoliberal discourses, anti-capitalist discourses. These discourses are everywhere in the social forum. However, as I'll talk about, these discourses do not ensure that old hegemonies and old marginalities are not being reproduced. Over the last 5 years especially, I have been thinking a lot about how hegemony and marginality is being reproduced in the social forum through, first of all, a study of feminisms in the forum, and more recently now a study of Indigenous positionality in the World Social Forum. So that's the first sort of trajectory out of which this project that I'm going to talk about tonight came from. The second is from my own activist history in Canada. And I live in Toronto. I'm from Newfoundland originally. I live in Toronto and have for the last about 25 years. And for a good part of that 25 years, I have been an activist person, and I spent more than a decade working in social justice coalitions, which were a fruit of really the anti-free trade movement in Canada that proliferated in Canada at different scales at the end of the 80s and throughout the 1990s. And in many respects, there are a lot of actually similarities between that kind of coalitional politics of the social justice movements in Canada and the World Social Forum, which we can talk about later if you wish. But just in general, what I'd say now is that those kinds of coalitions were broad-based, multi-issue coalitions. They were seeking to construct counter-hegemonic politics by bringing together many groups, many constituencies, many identities, many issues under one umbrella, but very self-consciously in a way that allowed and in fact encouraged and placed diversity and pluralism at the center of its politics. However, in doing that work over a decade, it was impossible not to notice and not to be troubled by, and continue to be troubled by, how these kinds of spaces are more often than not white-dominated spaces. They are the spaces of the white left. For all the rhetorics around anti-racism, around diversity, around now decoloniality or anti-colonial politics, that these are white-dominated spaces. So the spaces of the broad left, this new left, which you know, has many aspects that I'm and other people are very excited by, nevertheless is, in many of its iterations, a white politics. And what do we make of that? So those are two sort of roots of this project. I want to tell you just, give you a sense of where I'm going to go now in the next half hour or so, but before I do that, also to say that, well, I'm going to say some very critical and troubling things tonight about the World Social Forum and raise some, I hope, critical questions about the politics of global justice. My intention is not to tear down the Social Forum, nor to distance myself from the global justice movement. I'm a committed activist. I continue to be committed to the World Social Forum and to the global justice movement. But it's to think hard about the politics of global justice in the way in which it's been enacted at the World Social Forum, to think hard about that, and to think hard about this site of global justice politics as also a site in which Euromodernity is being reproduced, in which the hegemony of Euromodernity is evident, but also its crisis is evident. And perhaps some new politics might be being born in that crisis and that encounter. And the last sort of my initial comments is to say that this is very much a work in progress. That this work tonight is really about more about asking questions than it is about providing answers. And there are about 1 million questions about methods, about literatures, about how to situate this work. And I welcome any comments, advice, questions from you in the period after this, and we'll be continuing. I think we all need to be thinking about these questions, and there are no need, at least I'm not aware of any neat answers at this point. And the answers, I think, are probably much more likely to be produced in practice rather than in theory. So what I'm going to do is start with just a brief overview of this body of literature that has informed my thinking about modernity and coloniality. And that's a body of scholarship that has developed in Latin America, among Latin American scholars on modernity and coloniality. And I've turned to that in particular because the World Social Forum is a particularly Latin American phenomenon. And so I think it's important, at least one strategy for me is to be very aware of that Latin Americanness of the World Social Forum, and to be looking to discourses that are arising in Latin America, critical discourses about modernity and coloniality. Next, I want to tell you a little bit about the World Social Forum, and also to share with you a little bit about my appreciation of its many innovations and also of its potentialities. But then I want to get to the meat of the matter for tonight, and that is to talk about the history of the engagement of Indigenous peoples at the World Social Forum, which I have concluded, you see through my title, that it's a very troubling tale. It's a troubling story. And I want to just put out about, I don't know, 15 observations about this. And again, this is more about its observations, its questions, it's the beginning of thinking about what is going on here and what it might mean. And then finally to conclude with 3 or 4 thoughts about maybe some signs of hope, but also things that will just open up, I hope, the conversation. Okay. So in this work, there is a paper, actually. There's actually a text. So if anybody's interested in the text, I'm happy to share that with you. My first sort of strategy here was to try to construct a history of Indigenous people's engagement with the social forum, and to do that by focusing on the World Social Forum, on the world scale events of the social forum, particularly as it's taken place in Brazil. The World Social Forum was initiated in 2001. I'm going to tell you more about that a little further along. But just to say briefly that there have been 7 world-scale events. 5 of them have taken place in Brazil. So the Brazilian character of this practice is really, really important, I think, to recognize. So partly this is a Brazilian story. It's also a transnational, an international and a transnational story, which makes it very difficult also to figure out how to study it in a good way. But at least I want to just start by recognizing that this is really Brazilian practice I'm talking about. And what I did was I interviewed a number of organizers of the World Social Forum who are on its International Council, and a number of leaders and activists in Indigenous organizations that have been engaging with the Social Forum, in addition to, of course, looking at programs and documents and statements and so on. There's not much scholarly work been done on this yet. So this is really, it's an emergent phenomenon, and it's a very new phenomenon historically. Okay, now this literature on modernity and coloniality. So let me tell you a little bit about that. Scholars associated with the Latin American Research Group on Modernity and Coloniality, and these are people like Walter Mignolo, Enrique Dussel, Anibal Quijano, Ramon Brosfogel, Arturo Escobar, all men, take note. There are a few women beginning to write about this. There's a big question here about gender in this literature, but that's for another lecture. Let me just tell you about these guys, though. These scholars argue that coloniality is the underside of modernity and is constitutive of modernity. In other words, there's no modernity without coloniality, they argue. It's constitutive of the modern world system from its inception in the 16th century to the present. And they date the onset, actually, of modernity coloniality with the conquest, with the European discovery of the Americas and the conquest. Colonial difference, which is an important concept that they've developed, is that which has been rendered different through the coloniality of power. That which has been invalidated, shunned, and suppressed, and thus disappeared from world history through the global hegemony of discourses centered on Western civilization. That is through Eurocentrism. Furthermore, it is through their peculiar claims to universality, their systematic rejection of their own particularity, and their discrediting of other forms and traditions of knowledge as unscientific, that Eurocentric forms of knowledge have silenced the colonial other. So these scholars are positing a relationship between the global coloniality of power as a reality in the present, and also the coloniality of knowledge and that these two things are very intimately connected. This epistemic ethnocentrism, including of the political left, makes inclusive political philosophies grounded in Western traditions virtually impossible, they argue. And this is really important for the World Social Forum, in that it's the traditions of the left worldwide that are the underpinnings of the global justice movement. And those traditions of the left are very bound up with European modernity, even as they've been taken up in different parts of the world. These scholars converge in their agreement that solutions to the problems created through the modern colonial world system will not be found in the traditions of Western knowledge, nor indeed within modernity. And that, I would say, including in the global justice movement that remains thus grounded in these traditions. The alternative knowledges and practices that carry some possibility of redressing conditions of coloniality, that is, the exclusion and suffering of the world's majorities under capitalism, are those which have been suppressed by modernity, and which expose Western cosmologies as limited, particular, and arising from a geographically and historically specific cultural rationality that has projected itself as universal. So in this framework, the colonial difference is a privileged basis for knowing. It's an alternative standpoint. This is not a move to essentialize non-Western cultures, but to recognize, with Arturo Escobar, the articulation of global forms of power with place-based worlds. In other words, there are practices of difference that remain in the exteriority, meaning not outside, but on the exteriority, on the outer margin of the modern colonial world system. Incompletely conquered and transformed, if you wish, says Escobar, and also produced partly through long-standing place-based logics that are irreducible to capital and to imperial globality. So understood from within this analytic framework, anti-globalization movements are encountering each other on a historically unequal playing field constituted by the coloniality of power. Recognizing the character of contemporary world order as one of global coloniality puts decolonization on the agenda of movements worldwide, not just in their frontal contestations with hegemonic powers, but in the relations among the movements themselves, especially across North-South, non-Indigenous, Indigenous, and modern emancipatory subaltern other divides. The movements of the first halves of those foregoing couplets, North-South, non-Indigenous, Indigenous, modern emancipatory subaltern other, have been hegemonic relative to their others, historically and currently, in and beyond the spaces of the anti-globalization movement. These arguments, I argue, are provocative and potentially insightful in analyzing the difficulties between Indigenous and non-Indigenous entities in the anti-globalization movement and suggesting ways beyond this impasse. So that is the kind of analytic that has informed this work thus far. It's not the only possible analytic. And in fact, I'm interested in what other people hear in this perspective tonight and what literatures that you might think are promising. But this is the one that I've worked with up to this point. Let me now turn to the World Social Forum and tell you a little bit about that and why I think it has been such an important development. And also to get into the details of what the troubling tale is in terms of Indigenous people's engagement with it. The World Social Forum really is an innovation of the global justice movement. It was initiated in 2001 by Brazilian social movements in conversation with others, specifically in Europe, in the context of the massive anti-globalization demonstrations that were happening in many cities in the world, but for sure in the cities of the global north. So remember Seattle, the protests against the WTO in 1999, the big demonstrations in the US against the Republican National Convention, the big protests against the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas in Quebec City, big protests in Genoa. I mean, there's a whole series of protests in that period. They were big and they were growing, they were getting bigger, the conflicts were intensifying. And in that context, this initiative was intended to bring together the movements and groups of civil society from around the world who were united in their critique and their opposition to neoliberal globalization, but otherwise exceedingly diverse. And the idea was to create an open space, which is a very important concept of the World Social Forum, an open space in which these movements could come together in a space that was not so defined by the logic of protest. In other words, to create a forum, to create a space where they would come together, they would self-organize, and over a 6-day period, they would mount activities for one another in a variety of different modes with the intention of really communicating their struggles to one another. And that this would be done without any direction from a kind of central program planning committee. It would be a space where it would be a decentralized space where the program was actually constituted by the activities of the participating movements. Now, this was, it turned out, to be a kind of a brilliant move. In that, in the first World Social Forum, organizers thought they might get 5,000 people. And they got 15,000 people. After the first forum, it was so clearly kind of success that they quickly kind of constituted an international council, and they decided to make it, they would decide to do it again, maybe make it a permanent kind of thing. The second year, they thought, okay, let's organize for 15,000 and 60,000 people. In the third year, they organized for 60,000 people, and 100,000 people showed up. So, I mean, there's this incredible sense of momentum, of excitement, of possibility in this context. In the fourth year, the forum for the first time moved out of Brazil. It went to Mumbai, India. That's a whole other story, and that merits its own attention. But the event in Mumbai had about 150,000 people. And unlike the forum in Brazil, the event in Mumbai was predominantly a forum of subaltern peoples. It was a forum of tribal and Dalit movements, which is an incredible achievement in the context of India, where Dalit people and tribal people do not move in the same spaces, physically the same spaces as upper caste people. Incredible achievement. Anyway, there was enormous momentum around the social forum, and a lot of excitement about the character of this kind of space that was being created as a horizontal space of free association in which the movement self-organized in autonomous ways in a non-deliberative space. It was the forum, in fact, one of its kind of constitutive characteristics is that the forum does not issue statements or make decisions or take action. And that's very intentional, because the idea or the insight is that if these many movements are gathered and the object of the gathering is to create a program or create a manifesto, the entire time is going to be spent fighting over the manifesto. And they wanted to avoid that. There was a critique from the get-go of that kind of politics of hegemony, in the sense of groups lobbying and jockeying and maneuvering to get their word on the paper. So there was a rejection of that kind of deliberative politics. The movements were free and in fact encouraged to organize on their own terms. In other words, if they were engaged in a campaign or they were building a network, or they came and they did their own work in the context of the forum, which could include their own deliberations. But the forum as a whole did not deliberate. So the World Social Forum in those early years grew exponentially. It moved geographically. It certainly has transformed every time it has moved. And very quickly, there was an innovation to invite movements from around the world to organize social forums in their own places, at their own scales. So in other words, recognizing that this one gigantic, gargantuan event was a very limited event in time and space, and was very limited in terms of who could attend. So activist groups around the world were invited to say, take this idea of a forum and bring it to your own place. And, you know, stay in the spirit of what we try to have a social forum being, but do it in your own way, in your own place, with the movements of that place. And social forums have proliferated around the world. Again, taken up much more in some regions than others, which again is another story and another lecture. But what's very interesting is that it has proliferated around the world, and many people recognize the power of that mode of gathering, especially in the context of a history of left politics that has been so plagued by sectarianism, by forms of organizing that, you know, were really kind of zero-sum forms of politics. And this kind of practice of allowing plurality and diversity to just coexist, I think represents an enormous, enormous breakthrough. So there's a lot to say about the World Social Forum and a lot to say about its power and its potentialities. However, the subject that we're here to talk about really is some of the profound contradictions that are also appearing. And that is that the social forum is operating on the terrain of coloniality. And it's constituted by that. And, you know, one way to think about that is that the social forum is a contact zone. It's a contact zone in which movements are encountering each other, but they're encountering each other on this uneven playing field that is characterized by coloniality. Now, the paper that I've written has a detailed history with all kinds of footnotes and references and all that, that details over time the story as I have been able to put it together. What I'm going to do now is not go through the details of that story, but move to about 15 or so, 15 with some sub-notes, sub-points, about the character of Indigenous people's presence and contact and engagement with the social forum. And to do this in a way that I hope will raise some questions about the character of the politics of global justice as it is being enacted in the social forum in Brazil, but which I think actually has echoes for what we call the politics of social justice in many other places. So, number one, in its instantiations in Brazil, World Social Forum organizers did not until 2005, so this forum started in 2001, not until 2005 did they consider the absence of Indigenous people to be a problem that would require some attention. It wasn't even considered a problem. Since then, the prevailing discourses of the organizers of the social forum are of inviting them into the open space as one among many diverse self-organizing movements. This is related to what I think is a widespread tendency in the discourses of the global justice movement to construct the Indigenous movements as outside the movement and coming into the global justice movement, as opposed to, number one, having helped constitute the global justice movement from its first appearances as a recognizable movement of movements in the mid-90s, and two, having a history of resistance to colonialism that is 500 years old, and arguably the wider movement to which the rest of us, certainly in the Americas, should be seeking relation. This provokes troubling questions about the imaginary underpinning the World Social Forum's politics of inclusion through its efforts at expansion. Where have we heard those words before? There's a kind of politics of incorporation at work here that is important, I think, for us to think about. Secondly, Indigenous peoples as a term appears constantly in the list of movements in the World Social Forum and as an attribute of its diversity. Their issues are among an endless list generated by the movements in, quote, politics of undifferentiated difference. At the same time, Indigenous persons and peoples seem to occupy a special status as particularly favored icons of the movement. In Belém, which is the site of the 2009 World Social Forum, the faces of Amazonian Indigenous persons became central icons of the event, as seen in the posters around the city and on the masthead of the WSF. Even as their participation in the planning processes was very late, and their effect on the event and its discourses as a whole debatable. So my question here is, what is at stake for groups of settler or civil society in these representations of the movement of movements and the World Social Forum? Thirdly, where Indigenous people were actually present in the early years, as occasional presenters and as artisans and performers, their incorporation appears highly tokenistic and or exoticizing. Even more recently, where Indigenous people are present in larger numbers and with coordinated and forceful political discourses, individuals are often objectified by being photographed by non-Indigenous others. The recent auto-critique emerging from the International Council of the Social Forum's past history of it reducing Indigenous people's participation to the folkloric is double-edged, however, in my view. In that distinctively Indigenous modes of gathering and discussion, that is, doing politics in the social forum, include ceremony, rituals, expressions, and discourses that are experienced as different by the majority. And a rejection of the so-called folkloric by the left can be a demand to act, speak, and dress as we do, so that we can deal with you politically. Just as a side note to this, something I'm thinking about a lot here as well is increasingly there are spaces and moments where Indigenous participants in the social forum are invited to do ceremony, like to open up the forum or to close the forum or to have a ceremonial space in the forum. And that is happening, and it's interesting to think about the meaning of that. However, it seems to me that this is really happening again in the context of a kind of fair-like atmosphere where all kinds of things are going on all the time. And so I think it's rendered almost unintelligible to the non-Indigenous majorities there about what's going on. And it raises also very interesting questions about the kind of secular humanism that underpins a lot of the discourses of social justice and global justice, and their kind of inability to really come to terms with modes that are outside that kind of secular discourse. Okay, fourth, many calls for participation and declarations by Indigenous people in the World Social Forum and more generally start from an assertion of their presence on their territories since time immemorial and their shared experience of the conquest, their murder, dispossession, and enslavement, their 500 years of resistance and survival, and the continuation of these dynamics in the present. However, in neither documents nor discourses nor organizing practices of the World Social Forum in Belém in 2009, where Indigenous peoples had greater prominence than ever before, was there any recognition of Brazil or other nations of the Americas as colonial societies, founded on the theft of Indigenous land and the destruction of Indigenous societies. Fifth, the colonial character of nation states and their historical and contemporary role in exterminating Indigenous peoples, whether through violent dispossession of their lands and resources or through cultural assimilation, is almost completely unrecognized in the World Social Forum and by the majority of non-Indigenous movements present whose politics remain statist. national attachments are still the primary ways people in the social forum and in the movement identify themselves. And thus, Indigenous attachments to homelands and their relationship to particular lands, with nature and with earth beings, again, is almost, it's not even kind of, it doesn't register in the, it's at a different register than the discourses of the global justice movement as they're playing out here. Sixth, there is a silence or a refusal to recognize race in the World Social Forum. In fact, there's a great essay written by an African-American activist who's very involved in the organizing of the US Social Forum, where she says, the social forum doesn't do race well. And that is the gentlest understatement around. So I would say that there's a silence or a refusal to recognize race in the social forum, and I would argue in many spaces of the global justice movement worldwide, which are dominated by white people. And that this is related to the erasure of the colonial past and present. The World Social Forum's International Council is dominated by Europeans and Euro-Latin Americans. The World Social Forum in Brazil is consistently and overwhelmingly a light-skinned affair. This refusal to recognize the overwhelming whiteness of the space and of its political culture, coupled with the discourses of pluralism and diversity in the open space, make it exceedingly difficult to talk about racism, racial exclusion, subalternity, or coloniality within the global justice movement. Anti-imperialist and or anti-capitalist politics confer innocence on questions of race. I think this is a huge, huge, huge problem on the left. Okay, just a little sub-point there is that, one of the things I've been thinking about here is that the embrace of pluralism and diversity in the World Social Forum in the context of left movements is exceedingly important. And it's a big breakthrough because the left has had such a problem with pluralism and with political pluralism, with pluralism, its own internal pluralism. It's had a huge problem with that. So it's a huge thing that this is so central. However, the pluralism is starting to look like liberal multiculturalism. It's starting to look like a kind of pluralist politics in which diversity can flourish, but white supremacy doesn't really ever get too troubled. So there's something, really important, I think, to think about there in terms of the kind of pluralism that's being enacted, while really, and I really do want to defend the importance of pluralism as a political value. 7, the World Social Forum is constituted as a civil society space. Now, there's a big discussion I have about this, and again, how important this is in terms of the statist traditions of a lot of left and emancipatory politics. But it is a civil society space in that it is autonomous of states, parties, and armed groups. However, in the Americas and arguably elsewhere, civil societies are settler societies whose dominance is established through the colonization of subaltern populations, their lands, and their labor. And this kind of critical discourse of civil society, I'm relying on here a very important scholar named Joy Sen, who is from Delhi, from India, thinking in this way about civil society. Civil society, of course, is in the World Social Forum, and more generally, there's a kind of critical discourse of civil society that it's kind of liberal term and so on. But nevertheless, in the context of the social forum, civil society that's on the left, or critical civil society, is not problematized, but he's problematizing civil society in this way. Many of the entities present in the World Social Forum as organizations of civil society have been implicated in colonial projects past and present, including churches, NGOs, and others. So Again, the positionality of these organizations is highly variable in terms of their critical awareness of coloniality and their practices in the present. This kind of ambiguous history is rarely spoken of. 8. Another aspect of the modern civil society character of the World Social Forum, as manifested in its troubled interactions with Indigenous peoples, is the search by the World Social Forum International Council for Indigenous entities in Brazil organized in such a way and at such a scale so that its politics were intelligible to it. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that, and I've seen this, I saw this operating in Toronto and I've seen it operating elsewhere, the search for a kind of coalition like the International Council of the World Social Forum for an entity that could represent Indigenous peoples to itself. So they're looking for an NGO-like entity to represent Indigenous peoples kind of globally to itself at a scale, preferably national, whose politics were intelligible and acceptable to the left, and with which it could negotiate Indigenous representation with itself. So, Indigenous life in Brazil, like many other places, is small scale. It's remote from the cities, and it's community-based rather than NGO-based character of its politics rendered it fragmented and inaccessible and unintelligible politically. So there's a big sort of ugly story about all that. And of course, you know, one of the things I'm thinking about here is how much these relations between the World Social Forum and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous entities is starting to sound an awful lot like the relationship between Indigenous peoples and hegemonic states in which they live. So like, how is that, even in left movements, so many of which are opposing states and critics of the states and the polities in which they are working, how is it they're reproducing a kind of state, what I would see as a kind of statist politics vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples in this way? Question. Okay, the prevalence of rights discourses in the global civil society of the World Social Forum has provided some points of contact with Indigenous peoples' claims. But there's a big question here that's kind of haunting and not hardly articulated, let alone worked out, is what is the status of Indigenous rights relative to other rights? And a quote by Tom Goldtooth, who's an Indigenous activist in the US, that there's no sense in the social forum that Indigenous rights have to be foundational and first. So there is, and I don't pretend to have worked out what exactly that means, but there is a huge question here that is not even being asked about what is the relationship between Indigenous people's claims for homelands, for rights and resources, and the relationship with other struggles for social justice. Like, this is, it's not obvious what the relationship is here, I don't think. Among Indigenous organizations themselves, they are, not surprisingly, ambivalent about the social forum. Surprise, surprise, surprise. There are tensions and reservations among Indigenous movements themselves about the utility of the World Social Forum in terms of concretely advancing their struggles. There are enormous costs associated with participating, not only in the events, but as protagonists, which of course is what they've been called to be, protagonists in the process. There are costs associated with this, which are not generally acknowledged by non-Indigenous organizers who are more privileged, well-resourced, and live in cities, which are the loci of organizing. 11. There are debates among Indigenous organizers themselves about the value and effectiveness of creating separate Indigenous spaces with their own self-organized program in the World Social Forum. Now, this is one of the great potentials of the Social Forum, and many movements use it this way, is that regardless of their feeling about the Social Forum as a whole, as a project as a whole, they utilize the event as a way to gather their own people in their own space within the large event of the social forum. And Indigenous peoples have done this as well. However, there's a debate among them about the effectiveness of those kinds of separate spaces and their work dedicated to building their own Indigenous peoples movement in the Americas versus having their presence and discourses more dispersed through the site and through the forum and circulating among the other movements. This is a very similar kind of tension with, among women's movements. Between using this space to consolidate their own continental movement versus advancing their relationships with specific other non-Indigenous movements or intervening on the terrain of the World Social Forum as a whole. 12. There is an enduring concern among Indigenous organizers about their right to represent themselves in the forum and elsewhere. There are widely shared concerns about who is representing Indigenous peoples at the World Social Forum, especially in its governance bodies, and what the appropriate processes for mandating such representation from Indigenous peoples would be. And of course, this is very complicated by the fact that the World Social Forum is this internationalized space, and it's an event that moves geographically. So, you know, it's not stable in that sense in terms of the Indigenous peoples of a particular place. The organizers shift also when the event shifts. Related to this preceding point, the diversities and particularities arising from place-based, cultural, cosmological, and linguistic differences among the political discourses and practices of Indigenous movements render some of them more intelligible and recognizable as political to the movements and groups of civil society than others. Some Indigenous movements' discourses are more articulated, they're more connected, more intelligible to the major Western or modern political traditions. Some of the Indigenous entities have strong non-Indigenous voices that function as interlocutors with non-Indigenous movements. And of course, this means that some Indigenous politics kind of have more of an in into the spaces of the global justice movement than others. And they get a certain privileged position representing indigeneity in those spaces. For Indigenous entities, the World Social Forum is only one site among a number of important international venues. Building or participating in the World Social Forum, and I would say in the global justice movement, does not appear to be an end in itself, but is instrumental to the consolidation of an international Indigenous movement, especially in the Americas. Secondarily, the World Social Forum is seen as a site for alliance building with non-Indigenous movements. Further to this, there is some tension among Indigenous organizers between their priorities with respect to building their own communities, organizations, and networks, and they're addressing a wider movement. Just in closing, I just want to, I guess, offer a couple of thoughts about what is happening at the Social Forum currently and what's happening in Latin America currently that might be opening up this discussion in new ways, or at least unsettling ways. One is that, as I've said, the World Social Forum, when it's taken up in different places, becomes a different kind of practice. And in some places, the World Social Forum, in its regional iterations in the Americas, has taken place in places where there have been Indigenous majorities, and where Indigenous movements have taken a lead in organizing the Social Forum in their own place. So for example, this first Social Forum of the Americas took place in Quito, in Ecuador, where the Indigenous population is more than 40% of the national population, and there's a very strong Indigenous movement, and where the Indigenous movements were in the lead in that Social Forum. That created quite a different context for contact among the different movements that were gathered there, because the Indigenous movements were so big, so present, so visible and vocal, and it was a different kind of discussion. The same thing happened in Guatemala when the social forum was in Guatemala, the regional social forum. The United States social forum is also a really interesting practice in that it's a much more explicitly it has a discourse of anti-colonial politics. And people of color and mass movements of people of color are in the lead in the United States in the social forum process there. And that's creating a different kind of possibility, I think, in the US. The other thing that is happening in Latin America, as I'm sure you know, is that there has been a raft of left-leaning governments elected in Latin America. And the movements of the social forum, as it has taken place in Latin America, of course, have been very excited by this, and there's been lots of internal debates about the relationship between progressive movements, the social forum, and these left governments. Well, now these left governments in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Chile, are in major conflict with the indigenous movements in their own countries. The indigenous movements that in Ecuador and Bolivia helped bring those governments to power are now in very serious conflict with those governments, because those governments are continuing what's being called a neo-extractivist developmental politics. They are continuing, or they are embodying a kind of statist politics of developmentalism that's justified through a kind of new commitment to redistributing wealth, but nevertheless is still premised on extracting resources on indigenous land, and is not prepared to listen when indigenous peoples on those territories say no, that we want a different future than this. So those conflicts are really raising very intense questions for left movements for non-indigenous left movements in Latin America about the future of left projects and left politics. And in fact, Emanuel Wallerstein, who's a very prominent left scholar, has written recently about, in his view, this is the question for progressive politics in the 21st century, is whether it's going to be premised on economic growth, as it has been, even under so-called progressive governments, or whether there's going to be some new possibility that's being carried through ideas like buen vivir, which are these indigenous discourses of living well, not living better, living well, that are not premised on growth. So this is creating a new context for a new debate and new discussion in Latin America, and so that's the future is open in that sense. And finally, the next World Social Forum is taking place in January in Dakar, in Senegal, which of course will be yet another context for these kinds of questions to play out. But one very important thing that's happening there is that the indigenous movements of the Andes, which are very powerful politically now, have basically proposed that there be a major theme at the social forum on the crisis of civilization and the search for new paradigms. And this, after a very testy debate, has been accepted, and this is moving ahead as a major thematic terrain in the social forum. So the good news is that there is a space where this is now breaking open in a new way, in a more explicit way, in a more conflictual way, and that there might be some better prospect of non-colonizing dialogue across civilizational difference. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.